let's start where we should do, right at the beginning. Pulling Through begins on Boxing Day 2016. Tell us what happened and how Alan and your family's life changed from that point onwards.
Okay, well, yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you. We were, I would say, a completely normal, middle-class, lucky family. I'd say we just counted ourselves as blessed, but like everybody, when life is ordinary, you don't count your blessings perhaps often enough. Yes, we were down at my parents'. Alan was running his own business. The day before, he'd driven us down in his large company car on the M4. It was Boxing Day. We were all just having a normal, happy time. Suddenly, in the middle of a conversation, Alan was just telling a joke, actually. His face froze and he crashed to the floor, unconscious. And in the second that his face froze before he catch the floor, I remember thinking, I thought he was having a laugh, some sort of joke. I was kind of like, oh, if that's in very poor taste, pretending to, like, it just seems extraordinary now, but your brain does work very quickly. But then literally a second later, he was unconscious on the floor. I'd, luckily, I suppose, done a first aid course at work. I worked in a school a couple of months before. And my brain just kind of went into autopilot because we'd done exactly that scenario. What if someone crashes to the floor unconscious? His heart wasn't beating, his face was turning blue. The room was pretty full of relations. My children were there. People were screaming. It was absolute chaos. I did CPR. My sister rang an ambulance. It all happened very quickly. He came round, but he was not making any sense, crashing around like an angry bear, then unconscious again. It was absolute chaos. The ambulance arrived, took him to hospital, and they thought they could tell it had been a seizure. I thought originally it was a stroke. They said it wasn't, they could tell it wasn't a stroke. And they said, oh, looks like a seizure, looks like just one of those things, just a one-off seizure. Go and see your GP when you get back to London. So life sort of trundled on for a week, fairly normally, and then pretty much exactly the same thing happened again on New Year's Eve this time. So really chooses his moments, Boxing Day and New Year's Eve. Same thing, went into hospital, spent New Year's Eve in hospital. Quite an experience being in the A&E department on New Year's Eve. Again, they said, okay, there's 2 seizures is very different to 1 seizure, but at that point they thought it was maybe epilepsy. Again, went back home with an appointment to come to the epilepsy clinic in a couple of weeks, I think it was. So it was a very, very sudden thing. It had literally started from nothing. But in those couple of weeks before the next seizure, with hindsight, things did start to go wrong, which, again, I'm sure lots of people here will recognise the symptoms. Wasn't quite making sense. The odd thing he said was just a bit weird. But he was on tablets by then, anti-seizure medication, which they'd given him in the hospital. So I thought, oh, probably just the medication making him seem a bit weird. Anyway, I'll fast forward very quickly, but within another couple of weeks, he had another seizure, and this time it was more serious. Ended up back in hospital. They decided to keep him in, and within a week from that, then he went into a coma and was in intensive care. So it had gone extremely quickly from nothing to something, and he was unconscious for a week when we didn't really know whether he would live or die, really. And then following that, spent most of that year in hospital, half in Charing Cross Hospital in London, and then half in a brain rehabilitation on the other side of London. So really, right from the word go, like a lot of people, I think my thought was, this cannot be happening. This cannot be happening. This is some sort of crazy dream. And I just don't believe this is happening to an ordinary family like us. And then my second thought, I suppose, because I'm from a publishing background, was I need some sort of handbook. I need some sort of help here. They diagnosed encephalitis fairly early on. Within a couple of weeks, a doctor had said, hang on a minute, this looks like this will be encephalitis, which was lucky, I think. But there still wasn't any help or advice, really. I know you guys were there, but I was way too confused by the whole thing to even think of that. And I thought, what I need is a kind of a handbook. I need help. for this whole thing of going into hospital and having a serious illness, and I need some help. There wasn't any help. So long story short, I suppose this is the help that I thought that I needed. This is a kind of a handbook, really, of what happens when you get plunged into that crazy world of serious illness, rare illness, hospitals, and everything to do with that. So yeah, that was 5 years ago. I'm sure Ava will ask me later on, how is Alan now? But you can see Alan is sitting here with me now. So just telescope the 5 years into one. He did come out of the coma. He did survive, and he is here now. So. But yes, that's where it all started.
Okay, well, we want people to buy the book. I do understand you're going to be signing some books outside during our drinks reception. Is that right? So I would urge you to buy it, but we're going to dip into one or two aspects of the book. And the first one I'd like to dip into is something that I don't think is spoken about very often. And this is where you talk about how you felt the balance of your life partnership essentially changed from that first moment, really. And I just wondered if you could say a few words about that, because yes. I think it's something a lot of people will connect with.
Yes, I mean, that again was something I felt there seemed to be little available to talk about that. What had been written was by the very eloquent people who were able to talk about their own encephalitis. And obviously Matt was absolutely fantastic. I'm sure lots of people have probably read The Brain on Fire, Susanna Callahan, but I thought, what about us? What about the families? We've got 3 children, we've got 3 children. What about us? Who's talking about us, what it's like to have a partner or to have a child or to have any close relation or even friend who has encephalitis? It's the ripples, and I wouldn't even call them ripples actually, something more seismic than that, more like an earthquake going through the whole family. And yeah, that it has completely changed everything, really, both with my own relationship with Alan, but also Alan's relationship with the children, Alan's relationship with his nieces and nephews, with everybody, really. And I wanted to put down what that felt like, but also hopefully to offer some help to all the other carers, because again, like a lot of people, I had absolutely no idea how many carers there are out there in the UK doing looking after relations, and often again my children, they became carers too. I had no idea how many other children there are in the UK who are looking after people. So I wanted to make us visible, I suppose, because I think encephalitis is in some ways invisible illness. I know people have spoken about that, but I think, being a carer, you also feel extremely invisible. So I think the two things are often very connected, and I wanted to give a degree of visibility to that.
Well, let's talk about you for a second. I can't quite remember the quote, but I think it was Maya Angelou said something along the lines of one of the greatest torments in the world is not being able to express your own story. Was there a catharsis for you in writing?
Yes, there was, I think, but I suppose I would say I do think actually writing down what has happened to you is enormously valuable. I know it wouldn't necessarily work for everybody, and actually one of the things I thought about quite early on was all the different ways that people deal with illness. And like someone in the audience and Matt said, some people are very much, I don't want help, I want to get on with it, I want to do it myself. There are definitely different ways of coping with something like encephalitis, but for me, writing it down was always going to be a way of coping, I think, and I definitely felt just putting it down in writing what had happened was very valuable for me, and hopefully then valuable for other people to read. But I would personally say, even if you've absolutely no intentional desire to be published, I felt writing down your own thoughts really helped me process it. And to be honest, when I started writing, I had absolutely no intention of writing a book. The book came from notes that I'd written on my own phone, which was literally from the very first evening when Alan collapsed, and I just needed to get my thoughts down in order to process them, really. And after a year, when Alan had been in hospital and away for a year, I had a lot of notes on my phone, And I, you know, looking back on them, it helped me remember things that I thought I'd forgotten. It also, I felt we had, like I'm sure many people here, a family WhatsApp group from a very early stage in order to keep everybody in the family kind of informed with what was happening with Alan and being in hospital. And again, I felt actually writing down what the doctors had said to me in a way for other people, my children, to understand was actually a really, really useful way of helping me understand it, because often I hadn't taken it in properly. And then when I made the notes for myself, I thought, oh, okay, now I see it in black and white. I kind of get it more. So yeah, I would say it was cathartic, but it was also extremely helpful.
Okay, I've got two more questions. I've got time for two before we open it up to other people. What advice would the Catherine of today give the Catherine of 6 years ago, knowing what you know now?
Well, I think I've spoken to several people in the break, and I think whenever I've been at these events, it's always very humbling when you speak to other people, because you can become very absorbed in your own story or your own family story, and as soon as you speak to somebody else, the world opens up a little bit more and you think, oh my goodness, I hadn't thought of that, or that's a different angle. And I would say absolutely the Catherine that I was 5 years ago was blissfully, blithely unaware of the whole world that a lot of people are in as regards serious illness. And I suppose, it's massively, hopefully, taught me to be more empathetic and aware of other people, which I think obviously can only be a good thing. I mean, one of the things I explore, I suppose, in the book is this idea of, obviously, encephalitis is an awful, awful, awful illness, and it will be wonderful when we have a world where it doesn't happen, where we can treat it before it has the effects that it can have. And to start with, I think me and my whole family thought this was the worst thing it was the worst thing that had ever happened to our family, and it probably still is. But nevertheless, good things have come from it without any doubt at all. I think it's definitely taught my children a level of resilience that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And I think, again, very early on, I came to one of these events here, I think, and there was a doctor talking about the work she'd done with families, with young children and how they got through encephalitis. And she said very much that, the families who treat it as a challenge to be, a challenge for the whole family, and not to say it's a positive thing, but not necessarily to see it as an absolute disaster, tend to have much better outcomes than people who view it as a problem to be solved. And that made a huge impression on me. And I think that's definitely something I've tried to carry on with my whole family. I mean, I think the other thing that Dr. Thomas talked about, which is definitely made me very aware of, is that whole line between the blurry line, as I say, between the mind and the brain, in that I think I had perhaps misleading ideas about mental health and mental illness. And for a long time, I felt really, really strongly that it was really important that everybody knew my husband had had encephalitis and not some sort of breakdown, because I, felt that encephalitis was a proper illness, and it really frustrated me that nobody had ever heard of it. And but I think over the 5 years, I've realised that's extremely misleading and wrong way of looking at the whole thing, actually. And I was interested in what you said, because once Alan started to recover, I kept hoping that the hospital would provide some sort of, I suppose, what you would call psychiatric evaluation, because it became very clear that actually, although the doctors and the scientists looked at the scans and looked at the antibodies and they went, yes, it's GABA B, autoimmune encephalitis, great, and it was wonderful that the science had diagnosed it. But I kept thinking, okay, now we'll get on to the bit where they'll talk to my husband about his brain and help him with what you might call psychiatric mental health aspect of it. And nobody ever did, because I think that is the bit of joined up thinking that's perhaps missing at the moment with healthcare. And of course, the other irony of the whole encephalitis for our family is that the effect of encephalitis on Alan, the primary effect has been that he's got absolutely no short-term memory. So any sort of counselling, I'm sort of laughing because, again, I talk a lot in the book about how I think black humour does get you through a lot of this. Any sort of counselling or anything with Alan, he doesn't remember it the day after. So he won't remember today the day after. I know he doesn't mind me saying that, but he won't. So there is a sort of that whole thing of how you deal with someone's mental health following encephalitis. Again, that's been a very steep learning curve and made me more appreciative of all sorts of mental health issues because, you know, the big stumbling block in our case has been that Alan can't remember. With a lot of other people, there's probably another stumbling block, and I think it's made me hopefully more aware of the breadth of personality that there is, and how many you know, how we're all different, and there's no one way of tackling something.
Okay. Well, putting you on the spot for one final time, one of the people that you dedicate your book to is your mum, who you say taught you everything that you know about optimism. And in addition, there's fairly substantial chunks in the book that also refer to resilience. So before we open it up for questions, and I think we've all learnt the importance of resilience and optimism during the last 2.5 years. I know I have. So before we open it up for questions, let's close the interview, at least the bit with me anyway. What's your 2 top tips for optimism and resilience that the audience can take away with them today?
That's a really good question, because I think I always was quite an optimistic person, so that has stood me in good stead. But obviously that isn't a tip, because if you're not an optimistic person, you can't necessarily make yourself an optimistic person. Somebody said to me actually on the break, you can fake it till you make it, and they were talking about their own journey with encephalitis, and I think that is definitely true. And I think having a sort of positive outlook even when things seem bleak is a good thing to do, because as other people have said, things will get better. I think things will get better. So I think it is good to maintain a positive outlook. But I think also perhaps another tip, which is kind of not exactly the opposite, is I think sometimes I was so keen to bring my whole family, especially my children, on my positive, optimistic journey. Sometimes I think I went a little too fast, and I would say my other tip would be everybody has their own pace and way of recovering. So I think a sort of jolly optimism worked for me, but other people don't necessarily want to go at that pace. So I take that with a hint of caution.
Wise words. Thank you, Catherine.